Today, we can get the news instantly, at the click of a button. But in early modern England, things were very different. And in 17th century England, newspapers would only publish a new edition 3 times a week. That is until one woman came along and changed everything in 1702. Hi, my name is Bose. I have an MA in Early Modern English History, and on this channel we talk about the history you don't learn about in school. And this week we're going to talk about Elizabeth Mallet, whose work had a significant impact on the early modern printing industry. But she's very rarely recognised for this impact, and her name is almost completely forgotten in the historical record. In this video we will look at what were newspapers like in England before Elizabeth Mallet, who was Elizabeth Mallet, and England's first daily newspaper. I'll just go over a brief history of news printing in England up until the point of Elizabeth Mallet to give you some background information. In England, news began to be circulated in print text in the 16th century in what became known as relations, which are considered the forerunner to the newspaper by historians today. It would not be until the 17th century that the news would be printed regularly in periodical publications in England. At this time, the history of the newspaper looks very different in continental Europe, where news periodicals had already been established in several countries. However, in England, the Star Chamber Decree of 1586 forbade the publication of the news in printed text, and England's first news periodicals were actually printed in Amsterdam and brought over to England. These were known as courantos. In 1621, Nathaniel Butler would work with the bookseller Nathaniel Bourne to print the first couranto in England. These courantos evolved into newsbooks focused on domestic rather than foreign news during the English Civil War, and by the Restoration, Charles II would pass the 1662 Act, which said that every work needed to be licensed before it could be printed, limiting the number of publishers in England greatly. And in 1665, the Oxford Gazette was established as a government newsbook. However, by 1695, this act lapsed and was not renewed, creating an opportunity for many people to start publishing the news, such as Elizabeth Mallet. So who was Elizabeth Mallet? We have few records of Elizabeth Mallet's life, but we do know that in the late 17th century, she was operating a bookmaking and printing business with her husband, David Mallet. Elizabeth and David were part of a small group of printers who operated around Fleet Street and Newgate in London. They printed the accounts of condemned prisoners at Tyburn in the 1670s through until the 18th century. These accounts would be known as dying words. But around 1683, David died, leaving Elizabeth to run the family business herself as a widow. Left with 2 printing presses, a business and a household to run, Elizabeth quickly apprenticed her son, also called David, to the book-selling and printing trade. Perhaps she hoped he would take over the business. Although this wouldn't last for long, and Elizabeth quickly took charge again. During the 1680s, the Mallets were in a bitter rivalry with another local printer of the dying word accounts, George Croom. This rivalry would come to a head in 1684, when Elizabeth starts writing insults in the notes to the reader in her pamphlet of the last dying words. Elizabeth pointed out how untrustworthy and deceitful George Croom was, and she continued this campaign through May of 1684 until August. Eventually, George would surrender his stake in the dying accounts, and despite being a printer for 30 years, he would surrender his stake in the gallows literature to the Mallets. So we know that Elizabeth was a ruthless businesswoman, but we don't know much about her personal life. We know that she married David in 1672. We know that she had a son named David, but we don't know if she had any other children. And we know that she died in 1706, but we don't know when she was born. We know that Elizabeth published her work from the Black Horse Alley in Fleet Street, but there are so many aspects of her life that do not survive in the historical record today. But what we do know is that Elizabeth would have a significant impact on printing in early modern England, as she would create England's first daily newspaper in English. The Daily Current, England's first daily newspaper. On March 11th, 1702, Elizabeth Mallet published England's first daily newspaper, the Daily Current. A single piece of paper, the Daily Current had 2 columns with news about foreign affairs and shipping details. The reverse side was filled with advertisements. Elizabeth did not publish her newspaper under her own name. Despite a whole host of women being involved in the early modern printing industry, a newspaper written by a woman would not have been received well and would have been hard to sell. One reason for this is that women were believed to have an inferior intellect, and so they could not be trusted to report the news in a factual and correct manner. So, Elizabeth Mallet would use the name E. Mallet on her work, although this has had the effect of some people attributing her work to that of a man who doesn't actually exist. After 40 days of printing the Daily Current, Elizabeth would sell the newspaper to a man named Samuel Buckley. The reason for this is unknown. Samuel Buckley would continue to print the Daily Current for over 34 years before it merged with another newspaper. Samuel Buckley would also become famous in newspaper history as the printer of The Spectator, a newspaper that can still be found on the stands today. Today in Fleet Street, which is still famous for being the former heart of England's national press, there are 2 plaques dedicated to the Daily Current. Neither of them mention Elizabeth Mallet. Today, the British Library has a web page with a history of the newspaper on it. It mentions the Daily Current, but once again, Elizabeth Mallet is not mentioned. There is not much known about Elizabeth Mallet, but we do know this. She was an enterprising and ruthless businesswoman whose actions changed the shape and developed the printing industry in the late 17th and early 18th century England. And I think Elizabeth Mallet deserves some recognition for that. If you want to learn some more about England's unknown women, make sure you check out my playlist, Exposing Women's History. And come back next Sunday for another really random, really interesting video on history. That's all for now. Bye!